What makes a disaster a disaster? It's a simple question. Of course, the statement of it brings to mind all kinds of travesties and images of things that have happened in the past. The phrase can cover a wide range of possibilities. Some people include the recent elections with Donald Trump as a disaster, or the earthquake, or you can think of the earthquake in Haiti in 2010. What we will be going over for the next 6 minutes revolves around what makes a disaster so catastrophic, and I will argue that the cultural impact is what defines a disaster, not the actual fatalities listed. To do this, I will use examples of the 1896 earthquake and the 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan. I originally came across this argument when reading an article by Gregory Clancy, which has been posted to my blog previously under the bibliography. In this article, Clancy states in a brief paragraph that the reason the 1896 earthquake, despite large fatalities, was not given the attention it deserved because of how little impact it had on the culture and society of Japan. Before we dive into the meat of this, though, another aspect of what makes a disaster such a powerful force is the language that is attributed to describe it. Language is an interesting aspect. The different connotations that people associate with different words and different phrasings lead to different understandings. Idioms are a great example of how people use these. These earthquakes in Japan, though, were no different. While researching them, I came across an article about the origins of the word tsunami. Now, the word is used to describe most waves that result from earthquakes, but just over 100 years ago, the word was rarely used. In fact, Eliza Skidmore, who published the first account of the earthquake, was one of the earliest Americans to use the word tsunami. Even in Japan, it was not the sole word to describe such waves. The reason I bring this up is to make you think, why is this word used? What connotations can be attributed to the word tsunami that has made it the word of choice for today? And also, perhaps, why would Americans and everyone adopt a Japanese word to describe these waves? Back to our original question now, what makes a disaster what it is? In relation to the 1896 and 2011 disasters, the biggest difference in them is in the global reception they received. By this I mean that the reaction of the people across the globe impacts what makes a disaster qualify, in a way, as a disaster worthy of our attention. For instance, the 1896 earthquake received very few articles in the press. Gregory Clancy references this quickly as well. However, there is one American who reported on the earthquake quite well, whom I mentioned earlier as Eliza Skidmore. She was a reporter in Japan at the time of the 1896 earthquake and was working for National Geographic there. She describes in depth the amount of destruction the earthquake caused, along with giving information on some form of a recovery plan. Aside from Skidmore, there were others in America who wrote of the disaster, but they do a very brief statement of it. Some of them include fatalities, but the majority were bare bones of the fact with no reference to AIDS. The lack of information on the disaster contributes to the little impact it had. It makes sense that the more people who know of a disaster that occurred somewhere, the more people will care about it. Clancy echoes this statement again in his article, mentioning the term global village, referring to the fact that the whole world is one single global village. In this sense, the 2011 earthquake received much more attention than the 1896 one, and in getting more attention, it has become one of the worst disasters in recent years. The newspaper articles that discuss the 2011 earthquake do so in extensive detail across all nations. It is not difficult to find articles related to the 2011 earthquake. On the other hand, the 1896 earthquake received very little attention. Forward, away from the idea of the global perception is the idea of the recovery plans and the legacies of the earthquakes. To begin, the 1896 impacted an area that was mostly fishermen and poor people in the nation. Linking to the visual analysis I've done previously, there are few organized forms of aid. Skidmore, however, presented the fact that some form of aid was coming. She mentions how the people were devastated and drained of hope. The Red Cross Society had trouble caring for all the wounded, and even the soldiers were brought to help with the recovery. Compared to this, the 2011 earthquake received many news articles based on the recovering from the disaster. Many of these referenced the temporary houses in Japan as well, some of which are still being used 5 years after the event. While a lot of these do reference the Fukushima Daiichi reactor meltdown, that is an aspect stemming from the tsunami disaster. The continued interest in the recovery of the area affected by the tsunami is something that the 1896 earthquake did not receive. There were also books published that detailed a recovery plan for Japan. These books discussed the disaster in terms of recovery from the tsunami. In the books, they discussed the different plans to set into motion, as well as funding and even the impact on the fishing economy in Japan. These do mention the 1896 earthquake, though, very briefly. Going back to the economy for a second, the impact on the economy plays a big role in the legacies of these disasters. The fishing economy would have been similarly hit by both the 1896 earthquake as well as the 2011 one. Skidmore once again actually mentions how the fishing economy at the time was devastated by the 1896 disaster. Boats, along with nets and all fishing supplies, were wiped out to sea. While there is not an exact replica of this statement in relation to the 2011 earthquake, there is mention in one of the books that the fishers in Tohoku wanted the repairs done as quickly as possible to return to work. Both of these tsunamis impacted the economy of where they are in a similar way, destroying that land. Aside from the economy, though, there has also been a look at the living areas of the survivors from the 2011 disaster. One article discusses that the temporary housing may have more serious impact than expected to the people. It claims many of the elderly are unsure of when their properties will be fixed so that they can move back into their homes. This disaster is a continuous disaster, though. Even though people are not reading about it yet still, most people have heard of it by this point in time, and there are still numerous articles being published about it and following up on it. Global interest at the onset of the 2011 earthquake has made it into the disaster it is. While the 1896 one caused similar destruction, it was not blown into the global eye. The legacies of these disasters, aside from the Fukushima reactor meltdown, are quite similar as well, with the destroyed housing and the economy. The key difference is in the way that these disasters impacted everyone. The global impacts are the major differing points, and the way that people consider these disasters was quite drastically different at the time as well. The 1896 was viewed as a very unimportant one, whereas the 2011 one was considered a huge disaster.